Welcome to In the Loop, a podcast by Civic Duty Rice. We hope you have had a great first 2 weeks, and thank you so much for tuning in. We're excited to kick this semester off revamped and better than ever. My name is Remy Slimp. I'm a freshman at Hanson College, and I'm one of the two new MCs.
And I'm Max Martucci. I'm a freshman at Sid Richardson College, aka the best college, by the way. I'm the other one of the two MCs. Don't worry, you guys. Your favorites, Akash, Meredith, and Sonia, will all be back eventually. But for now, let's get started with our first episode of 2018. We're focusing on the totally non-controversial, non-lightning rod topic of free speech in America and on college campuses specifically.
You know, I'd say sarcasm is unbecoming of you, but that's not true in the slightest.
So the general topic of this podcast, or our little friendly debate that we're going to be doing here today, is, of course, free speech. And the specific question is, do liberals and or conservatives think of free speech in the correct way, under the correct context? And is free speech, specifically on college campuses, because, of course, that's where Remy and I and Sonia and Meredith and Akash all reside, is free speech specifically on college campuses under greater threat from the political right or the political left? Now, we're not going to outright state our political affiliations at the beginning of the podcast, as that would detract from the fun of it all.
Oh, yes.
But hopefully by the end, you'll be able to guess. What Remy and I, how Remy and I opine, or maybe we'll just tell you. So, with that, I think we're going to start off with probably the most notable example of a free speech debate in America today, and Remy, how about you talk about protests at college campuses?
All right. Well, one example that comes to mind to me when I think about free speech on college campuses and sort of the struggle between, I guess, those who identify as liberal and conservative is back in March of last year, there was Charles Murray, who's a very conservative speaker, was scheduled to have an event at Middlebury College up in Vermont. And basically what happened was the students didn't
take too kindly to his message.
Yes, very much so. There was a bit of a mob that occurred outside of his event, and one of the professors that was escorting Mr. Murray to his to where he was going to speak, one Allison Stanger, was actually sent to the hospital after protesters became more and more violent, and she actually suffered from a concussion.
Right. So essentially, as a consequence of the students, some might call it activism, right?
Yes.
That's of course a mild word for it, but as a consequence of the students' activism, right? This professor ended up injured, right?
Yes.
So what I would ask you then is what is the point which you're gonna attempt to make here?
I believe personally that college campuses do have sort of a need to facilitate free speech in all its forms on their campuses, whether or not they have a political bias in any particular direction.
Sure.
But I think it's also important of the speakers to understand to whom they are speaking.
Yeah.
And just sort of
understand their audience.
Yeah, like to sort of just opine at a group of students that won't agree with you for the most part, even if there is like a large body of people who do follow your
school of thought.
Yeah. You just to be more mindful all around, I think, is something that is necessary in a college environment. Right.
So would you say I'm going to make a statement here, and if I want to see if you agree with me on it or not.
All right.
Do you think that private universities have a legal obligation or a moral obligation, or neither, to allow speakers to give addresses on their campus no matter what the speaker's political affiliation, no matter what beliefs they hold? Because I suspect this is an area of belief in which you and I are going to differ.
Right. I would say it's more of maybe an ethical one, just in terms of like college campuses where you kind of go to grow, develop, meet other people who are of differing opinions. This is something that I think Rice does very well, and that's one of the reasons that I was attracted to Rice in the first place.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they are bound legally by just like freedom of speech.
I mean,
because
you check us on this, but they're private universities. There's no conceivable way that they're legally bound to it. Right?
Yeah, for private universities. Public universities, it's different sort of scenario, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess that's kind of where I stand for the most part.
So I guess the more interesting question is a question of morals, right? This is going to be the one that really splits liberals and conservatives, because I feel like everybody agrees that a private university has the legal right to prevent a speaker from speaking on their campus, right? Maybe not everybody, but that's at least how it would seem.
It depends.
The question that I would ask is, these universities where, as you said, people go to learn and be exposed to new opinions, right? Where do we draw the line between a threat and an opinion? You know what I mean?
That is a very good question. And I think that's one that people have to ask themselves as well. But like, you have to consider with every opinion, like, can it be considered a threat just by like the opinion being stated? But you also have to think about how opinions are expressed in other formats, like for example, symbolism and like say things like protests or other demonstrations, because there are of course many different ways that opinions can be expressed. Whether it's through verbal action, physical, or like sort of a manifestation, or virtual, like Twitter or social media, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah.
You have to kind of consider all sorts of different factors when it comes to evaluating opinions, I suppose.
So I guess my opinion, in contrast to yours, on that is, I think that there's a fairly clear line between opinion and threat, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Or even if there's not, I think that we should draw one just for the sake of argument.
All right.
Right. Because oftentimes when we talk about free speech, the divide is more of an ideological one than a practical one.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the sort of lightning rod figures for the free speech debate has been this frankly kind of nasty figure named Richard Spencer, who's a leader of the internet political movement known as the alt-right.
Mm-hmm.
And the alt-right, for lack of a more accurate or maybe less blunted word, is it's a neo-Nazi movement, right? They model their principles after those of the Nazi Party in 1930s Germany. They're cookie-cutter neo-Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this guy gave a speech on the University of Florida campus a few months ago, and got shouted down halfway through. Had to leave the stage. It was, leftist groups saw it as a victory. Alt-right groups saw it as a sort of violation of his right to free speech.
Mm-hmm.
And I, as those who know me might suspect at this point, I sort of align with the leftist groups on this one, because sort of their viewpoint, right,
mm-hmm.
is when somebody's right to free speech or when somebody's free speech itself is centered around an ideology that elevates ethnic cleansing or genocide as a core principle, right?
Right.
And again, I'm not implicating conservatives as a wider political group here. I'm specifically referring to this single online movement. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When somebody's ideology advocates for dangerous things like that, it is the responsibility of civically engaged individuals to stand up to that ideology and shout it down at every possible opportunity,
mm-hmm.
right? I think that if somebody's quote unquote right to free speech has to be either infringed upon or taken away or squashed or heckled at, in order to prevent something like that from happening, I think that that's a necessary evil. I think you have to pick between them. And I think in the case of Richard Spencer, I think it's okay to go to this guy's rallies and drown him out with shouts of racist. Okay. I think that that's the correct way to handle this. And of course, that's a easily attacked viewpoint. And Remy, I look forward to hearing your rebuttal.
Yeah. So I myself align a little more with the sort of the middle of the, I guess, moderate Republican group as opposed to Richard Spencer. And but
I'm glad to hear you're not a Richard Spencer fan.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate that you appreciate that. Oh, Lord. This is one of those things where like I don't know exactly how to put into words what I feel because while I as I said before, I think like college is sort of a place where you sort of you should be encouraged to be exposed to alternative viewpoints of the world. That's I
mean, at some point you have to start debating the validity of a viewpoint, right?
Yes, that's.
I mean, you can't just let somebody come up on stage and and spout unsupported racist rhetoric for 45 minutes.
Yeah, but by that same token, are you allowed? Where do you draw the line in the sense of this is dangerous versus this is something that we don't like, but we should probably hear anyway.
Yeah.
Richard Spencer's opinion, it definitely relies more on the dangerous side, but people might use that to justify shouting down those who would be closer to the middle, but are still kind of having different viewpoints, like a Trump supporter who isn't alt-right, but believes that Trump was just overall the better choice over Clinton.
Yeah.
Something like that viewpoint, basically, which is farther right but not alt-right.
So, Remy, you bring up a really good point about sort of the difference between Richard Spencer types and normal, sort of more mainstream Trump supporters.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess if I had to pick one mainstream Trump supporter to talk about, I would go with a guy named Carl Icahn, who's this big Wall Street guy, super rich, typical mainstream capitalist.
Okay.
Venture capitalist guy, I think. And he was a Trump supporter throughout most of the election for fiscal reasons, right?
Yeah. Obviously.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if he was a firebrand in the primary, but I know for certain he voted for Trump over Clinton, right?
Yeah.
And one does wonder if the same arguments that people use against Richard Spencer would be used rather incorrectly against Carl Icahn under the same context, right? But one thing that I think sort of unites the two situations that most reasonable people should be able to agree on, right, is that an administration, or rather a government, right, shouldn't respond to anti-conservative protest by limiting the protesting rights or free speech rights of protesters, right? And this is an issue that we're starting to run into, right? And I'm thinking of one particular instance. The Wisconsin state legislature a few months ago. It was on June 22nd, 2017. They've been pushing this law for a while that enforces the either suspension or expulsion of students who disrupt campus speakers. Disrupt, of course, being a term which is used very, very loosely.
Yeah, I think that is a very vague term that you have to be careful with, because disruption could mean orderly or just chaotic. And
yeah, it can mean anywhere from signs to Molotov cocktails.
Oh yes.
But of course, no Molotov cocktails have been thrown so far. So
I should hope not.
Yeah, I agree. But essentially, this was a conservative-pushed bill. This was a bill that received conservative backing and was hardcore opposed by every Democrat in the Wisconsin State House.
Okay,
right?
Yeah.
Now, what I'm wondering, Remy, is if conservatives are so vehemently pro-free speech, right? Why is it that the Wisconsin State Legislature, which is a conservative body as of now, pushed forth a bill to limit the free speech of students of students on the University of Wisconsin campus when it comes to campus speakers?
Well, supposedly the policy states that students have something like a two-strike rule in regards to violent and disorderly conduct. These students would be suspended, and then students that have disrupted the free expression 3 times would be expelled. Now, that doesn't take away from the fact that this can be considered sort of a dangerous way of going about this, because it is, given the timing of this bill, it can be seen as extremely reactionary and such. But I think the general purpose of the bill is to basically encourage students to sort of, I guess, I want to say have more of an open mind to speakers of different perspectives and different viewpoints,
right,
especially those that oppose them. Because I think there is a legitimate issue with some groups that basically it's less of an issue of they see it as violating their right to free speech as much as it is they can't seem to find another way to more respectfully disagree.
I take issue with that viewpoint because as you of course knew I would, along with everybody else in the room. Sort of the part of the Wisconsin law that I take issue with now that I'm actually reading it is the part in the violent and disorderly clause. I don't like the word disorderly, because disorderly is such an entirely subjective word that it's almost completely left up to the campus's jurisdiction, to the school administration's jurisdiction, as to whether a student should be punished, right? And with regard to the 2 or 3 strikes policy, I mean, come on, that's a token thing, right? They're giving you a punch card for free speech, which I think is a little bit ridiculous and regressive. And by the way, I should state that the Wisconsin legislature isn't the only one to enact laws like this. According to an article in the Washington Post, which I have open on my computer right now, similar measures have been enacted in Colorado, and they've been introduced in Michigan, North Carolina, Virginia, and California. Colorado, so it's not just states with red legislatures like Wisconsin. Republicans and conservatives nationwide are introducing bills like this, and even blue state legislatures, right? Yeah. Additionally, right, I think that there's this popular bias against quote-unquote disorderly protesting. I think that we sort of have this nostalgia for the days of, of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, with the key word being civil, right? Because, we romanticize these protests as, everybody joined hands in Kumbaya and protested against the evil establishment, right? But that's not how it was. The fact was, at the time, these protests, just like every other protest, were viewed as disorderly. They were viewed as, presumptuous. They were viewed as aggressive. You can't have a meaningful protest that isn't fueled to some degree by anger. You cannot have strong feelings without disorderly protesting. And if you devalue a protest solely based off of the fact that you view it as disorderly, then you're infringing on their right to free speech.
I would say that I don't know if I would agree with the idea that a protest can only be sort of successfully, I guess, energized by anger. What is the limit, I guess, on a disorderly protest? What do you prefer? What do you call sort of, I guess, an orderly versus disorderly protest? And what I'm kind of getting from your argument is that if we try to classify any particular protest as disorderly, then and we try to do something about that, then we violate the protesters' right to free speech. But there are limits to what we classify as free speech. Like, you can't yell fire in a building, you can't pretend to have a gun in a public space, and most importantly of all, you can't just have a protest that is kind of framed in such a way to incite violence. That is when the federal government can legitimately step in and bring it to a close if people's lives are threatened, for example, by a protest.
So I guess a very, very short rebuttal to that, because we have to get on to other topics here. But I just want to clarify my own position on the topic. Essentially, I should have been a little clear. I don't think that again, the problem with the Wisconsin law that I had wasn't with the word violent. It was with the word disorderly. Right?
Because you don't see it as vague.
I don't condone. Yeah, I see it as vague. Right. I don't condone violence under any circumstances whatsoever. I don't condemn threatening rhetoric under any circumstances whatsoever. But I do. Sorry. I don't condone. But I do feel like that a lot of times, like Remy said, the word disorderly is vague, right? I feel that it can encompass anything from truly violent behavior to stuff that people just want to see as disorderly. So that was the point I was trying to make. Yeah. But the topic that I want to move on to is sort of something on a more national scale. Again, we're on a college campus, but that doesn't mean we can just ignore everything that's happened elsewhere in the country. And there's a lot of free speech related stuff that's actually happening at the level of our national government. And most of it is, dare I say, Israel related. We're not going to get into the whole Israel-Palestine issue this episode because,
that is a complex geopolitical situation.
Yeah, honestly, if they can't finish a war in 2,000 years, I don't think that we're going to be able to duke it out in 20 minutes. I don't think it's going to happen. But so I guess what I wanted to say is, a lot of the conservative arguments about free speech are, look at this campus speaker who was shouted down by protesters, right? They focus on campus policies rather than policies of the federal government, right?
And to be fair, campuses are, for the most part, more liberal-leaning.
That's true. Yeah. I want to focus here on a policy or a string of policies that's recently been put forth by the federal government that are kind of worrying me because although again we're not going to get into the whole Israel-Palestine issue, I would say that there's no political ideology in America that's more marginalized than that of the anti-Israeli or pro-Palestine or supporter of Palestine. Mm-hmm. And, Democrats have to be nominally supportive of Israel. Republicans toe the party line on that one as well. And the federal government has recently started to enact a string of, I think, pretty worrying laws that relate to free speech and the expression of anti-Israel or pro-Palestine viewpoints, especially on college campuses. In fact, there was recently a law that was put forth in the U.S. House of Representatives which made it illegal for businesses that received money from the federal government to boycott Israel, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if you're a fan of Citizens United, you, I assume, believe that money constitutes speech, right? So if you prevent somebody from spending their money in legal fashion or from not spending their money in a legal fashion, right, then you are impinging upon their speech, right?
Okay.
Now, another example that I like to put forth is actually something that's a little less widely known, if that's possible. Donald Trump recently nominated a guy for the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. And what the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights does is they decide how to spend the Department of Education's resources, with regards to investing potential violations of student civil rights, right? Mm-hmm. So Obama's Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights, decided to spend money on looking into possible instances of anti-black or anti-brown discrimination in the admissions process, things like that, right? Anti-trans discrimination on school campuses, right?
Right.
Donald Trump's nominee to head up the office was actually a leader at a legal firm that was whose essential sole focus was to pressure college campuses into shutting down pro-Palestine student groups, right? Mm-hmm. You'll have to look at the article. It's listed underneath the podcast, but they did this at several universities where they basically totally shut down student groups who were anti-Israel or pro-Palestine. And again, this is the guy who's going to be deciding how to spend the Department of Education's civil rights funding. So I think that there's a worrying trend across certain agencies of the federal government in general where the government is essentially enforcing the majority's opinion on those who disagree with it, right? Mm-hmm. They are muting the voices of those who may not be staunch supporters of Israel or who may not be vehemently anti-Palestine. And of course, whether or not you disagree with that, Remy, I think we can agree that that's not an ethical thing that the federal government.
All right, so that is not something that we can sit well with. But by that same token, that still does not undermine the fact that we can't have just unlimited free speech. There needs to be a line drawn where it becomes violent, legitimately disorderly, as opposed to just the vague definition of disorderly, and actually inciting of violence. But let's try to bring this back to Rice, I suppose.
How does the issue of free speech not really affect Rice?
Okay.
Because that's sort of the discussion that we here in the room have been having over the course of the past couple of days. Yes. Is why aren't Rice students more politically engaged, right? I think Remy and I, along with Sonia and Akash, if I may speak for them, sort of feel like we as Rice students tend to, for some reason, tend to be a little bit less politically engaged than our counterparts in academia. Mm-hmm. And we find it a little bit strange because Rice kids are smart. We know that we're informed.
Not to be tooting our own horn.
Not to be tooting our own horn. But we know the Rice kids are smart. We know that we're informed. We know that we're passionate about at least something. So the question is, why are there more campus protests? Some might say exercises of one's right to free speech at places like Brown or Yale than on campuses like Rice. And Remy, I wonder if you'll agree with me here, but it seems like the conclusion we came to the other day was just like kids have a lot of homework here. Like, there's no other way to put it.
There really isn't. Just I don't know how it is in regards to work at Ivy League schools. I imagine it's plenty copious on its own, but like that. At the end of the day, Rice kids seem to care more about just their classes and their work than I guess expressing these opinions that they have outside of lunch table conversation. But I think even that it's good to have those conversations and I guess
sort of expand your worldview a little bit.
Yeah, that. As I said earlier, college is kind of a place to go for getting a taste of viewpoints that don't kind of come from where you came from, I guess. That's kind of why we have the residential college system. We meet a lot of people that aren't in our field of major or
aren't in our immediate political circle.
Right. I mean, besides the other reasons that we have it, it's one of the big ones, I think.
Yeah. So actually, on that note, I think we cited the homework reason, but there's always the possibility that there are certain kids here who don't get politically engaged because they don't know how to, or because there aren't opportunities that are feasibly available to them.
Mm-hmm.
And with our, we like to end each episode with a call to action. And I think the purpose of this one is kind of, if you're interested in becoming politically engaged, in exercising your right to free speech, whether that's through campaigning on social media for a particular congressional candidate,
mm-hmm.
or protesting for a cause that you hold dear. There are ways to do all these things, and Remy has some ways to get involved, and I do as well. For me, Rice has a local sector of the ACLU. If you want an organization that advocates for free speech on a local, state, and national level, mm-hmm. There's really, I won't say that there's no better one to go to, but the ACLU is absolutely a sterling representative of the First Amendment across the country. Additionally, if you're interested in exercising that same right to free speech through campaigning for somebody who aligns with their values, right? There are primaries coming up. The Texas 7th District primary, Democratic Republican, is coming up,
and even I don't know about comparing importance, but the Texas gubernatorial race is also this year.
Mm-hmm.
I myself am working on an internship for Texans for Greg Abbott,
mm-hmm.
And basically going door to door, conducting surveys of people whether or not they would vote for the governor, and then over time we will kind of progress from, I guess, surveys to sort of trying to persuade the voters who consider themselves sort of middle ground, or might be supporters of Abbott but might not feel that their vote would count for much and so aren't as compelled to go out and vote. But even aside from that, you also have the Baker Institute Student Forum that organizes some great events that you have a lot of diversity of opinions on featured in some of their forum events, mm-hmm. and overall it's a great organization that you should get more involved with.
Yeah, and to provide one final plug before we close out, Civic Duty Rice.
Absolutely.
Club, yeah, I had to. The club which sort of sponsors this podcast. That's our focus. That's what we try to do is get people like us, people our age, more politically involved.
Mm-hmm.
We're holding events. You could check our Facebook page anytime. We'll put dates and descriptions underneath the podcast to make it easily visible. For now, I think that's just about all we have time for today.
Yep.
So, Remy, great first podcast, and we'll see you guys next time around.
Thank you for the friendly debate, Max. Signing off now.
No problem.
And so, those are some ways you can get involved. We hope that you have a great rest of the week. Thank you for listening, and please leave comments and join the conversation. We try to be unbiased here, but we can't truly get all the perspectives without you, our listeners.